All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome back for another critique. Today we've got week 5 of Art Camp 3. So we're talking all about lighting setups. This is a really important one. It's essential to learn how the different lighting setups work and how to convey them as best as possible. Um, with landscapes, you really do have only a set number of lighting that tends to happen. When you start getting into interiors and figurative work, obviously there's a lot more variety because there's a lot more, you can have a fire light, for instance, and how that differs from an overhead incandescent light bulb and all that kind of stuff. So you get tons and tons of variety, but with landscapes, you usually have only a few different kind of types. The sun only moves in certain ways, and so aside from some different artificial light sources that'll eventually show up in your landscapes, you're really limited to these few. So trying to nail these down and really master them is super important. And so hopefully you guys have done a good job. I took a quick look before, and it seems like we've got some good stuff to go over today. And yeah, so we'll actually just dive right in. I, of course, am always taking a look at the chat, and I'm happy to answer any questions you guys might have. I will do my best to follow the chat. The YouTube app does a terrible job on the phone of updating sometimes, and I have no idea why, but that's the way it goes. Um, so if it seems like I've missed your um, comment or your question, uh, I will do my best to answer that. Any way to bring up the volume level a bit? I can try to speak up a little bit, but actually, no, there's not any easy way to do that. Hopefully, it's not too drastically low. If it is, I can correct it for next time. Hopefully, you guys can hear me well enough ish. Just max out the volume on your computer. Hopefully, that does the trick. All right, so we're just gonna dive right in, and I'll try to give you guys some good things to think about. So the big thing we want to think about is sort of what I've been talking about, kind of every time in the critiques, and that is that you don't necessarily want to ever copy the reference. We're always trying to make good images, not just copy what we're seeing. So what we're trying to do this week is we're trying to convey the sense of lighting as best we can, regardless of how well the photograph might portray that sort of lighting. So there are times we're going to have to stylize things. There are times we're going to have to change things from the reference, and it's an important thing to think about. Um, so we'll just dive right in here. I think overall these look very good. I think the thing I'm seeing here is you're not using enough blue. You uh, you're really avoiding using blue in all of your distant mountains and stuff. When you start looking at this compared to this, you really lose the sense of atmosphere um, when you take out those really nice cool tones. Even when you're looking at this, even though it's a very subtle transition between these two layers, uh, you can tell they're both very gray, kind of muted greens, but they do shift slightly towards blue. Um, they they um, they will move a little bit in that direction, and by doing that, you separate these two planes. Really important thing to get across. Overall, they do have a good sense of lighting, though. It does work fairly well. You've got a good sense of this nice kind of diffuse overhead lighting. Everything's nice and soft there. You've got a lot of nice grays in there. Um, this has got a pretty good sense to it of what the lighting's doing. Really, I think the one that probably needs the most is probably actually your side lit one here. Side lit can be a little bit tricky to balance because obviously we've talked about values a lot, and we've talked about how You need to separate the ground from the sky, and you need to separate all your different layers. And now we're thinking separating your lights and your shadows. And part of the nature of having a direct side light is uh, you've got a fair bit of contrast. So you want a fairly distinct, sharp, crisp contrast between um, your different groupings of light and dark. But you don't want to go so far that you throw it out of proportion with a landscape. You don't want it so that your skies are looking too dark or your ground's too bright. So there's a lot of kind of a balancing act when you're doing this stuff to make it read how you want it to. So one thing, even though you haven't used enough blue in the background here, that also kind of means that you've used a little too much blue in your foregrounds, since they're all sort of the same green. You're sort of using the same green between these two layers, and they're distinctly different. And at some point in this transition, that happens because there's a lot of distance here. There's a lot of scope, and it's important to get that across. So actually, a lot of the really nice lighting here is happening from some of the values here in the foreground, where I think you can actually push the values perhaps a bit more than you have. And it's not even necessarily that you need to go all dark or all light. Really, I think you can kind of push things in both directions, where you can actually lighten up some of the stuff with perhaps some more saturated blues, as you can kind of see them in there. You can see this illuminated blue in the shadow side, which is obviously coming from this really, really blue sky we've got up here. And so making sure you capture that is quite important for getting this sense of light. And then by having a few highlights of really dark darks, really needs to be a better word for that, by the way. But by doing that, you get that full value range and shows that it does get really, really dark in these shadows. So you get that necessary contrast. And you've got a few areas in here where actually you get some kind of nice warm bounce light in here. It's also kind of important to almost play up and stylize. Anytime you get a chance to do bounce light, go ahead and just really, really pay attention to it. It's rare that you get a chance to. There's not enough bounce light in the world, so go ahead and play it up. So your lights are more or less correct. Weirdly enough, some of them could actually use to be a bit darker, um, even a little bit bluer. They might have gotten a touch too yellow. Wrong about that. Could just be that they need to be a little grayer, which will look actually a little bit warm. Yeah, I wonder if they could actually go a little bit bluer by darkening some of them. Uh, I get a better idea of the value range. Obviously, I know these are fast studies for the most part today, um, but even though they are relatively quick studies, uh, should still be able to get in some of these important things like the blues. Because the main reason you want to do that is you don't get the same sense that there's a really bright blue sky, and that's one of the important aspects of a light setup like this, is that there is this strong, strong sense of um, blue sky illuminating everything in the shadows. I think you could do with kind of darkening some of your greens here in the foreground. It'll help to pop out these uh, bright colors without uh, changing their values too much. So we talked about how it's all a balancing act. This is one of those ways that you can make it seem like your brights in the foreground are a little bit brighter without actually making them brighter and changing the value so much that the sky looks out of place. Bringing in some darker greens. So just a little idea there, but I think it will help a fair bit. Obviously, the background could also go way bluer, stuff way back. Um, think about think about separating those layers and how you're going to do that, and making sure that you get enough atmospheric perspective in there. You really look at the reference. These mountains are really far pushed back here. You can see these distant ones are barely any value difference, just enough to separate, and it's because they're so far away. And you've got all this atmosphere between you and them. But yeah, so overall looking good. I think you're leaning a little too warm in general with your colors and missing out on some of the nice atmosphere in the distance. But overall, I think you're on the right track. So yeah, looking good. All right, these look great. I really like what you've done over here on the right with actually changing your reference. I think you've done a really good job of stylizing it in such a way that I think it actually kind of works better than the original reference. Um, you could have gone maybe a little bit closer to the reference, but I kind of like the way you've stylized it. It works quite well. You've seen the nice blue light illuminating everything in the shadows and contrasting against this nice warm morning or evening light. So I think that works quite well. Um, I think the one I actually mainly want to talk about is this one here in the middle, as you've sort of done a similar thing of trying to kind of interpret the reference, which is good, but I feel like it's lacking a little bit of something. Um, 'Cause this has a lot of impact and a lot of punch to it. The colors and values are wrong. They're sort of what photographers think looks good in photography, and maybe it does. I'm not a photographer, and I'm not going to sit here and critique photography. But as far as using for reference for landscapes, the values are pretty darn wrong. Things are not actually going to get as dark as they tend to get in photography. Things are not going to get as bright. They're going to just kick up the contrast a lot. Um, but I think the thing is that I do like how this background is working and how dramatic it looks. And I feel like you're missing out on a fair bit by ignoring that. Because part of the reason that the values and colors are what they are here in the foreground is that there's some relation to what's happening in the background. I think a little bit of that got lost. I wonder what would happen. Just darken these things up a little bit. And I'm not going to go as dark as the photograph because I do think that if you just copied it outright, you'd end up with a way too contrasty image. I do feel like a little bit closer can get you some nice stuff. And same goes for the clouds and the sky. I think in your effort to interpret the reference, you actually took out some of the impact. And I think there's a little bit more value range that you can get up there. One of the things I love about this reference image is these really nice warm lighting on these rocks, and then this really dramatic lighting on some of these over here. I find that really nice, and I think balances well against the nice cool colors they've got back there. And I kind of want to get some more of that in the image. Part of what actually needs to happen is the sky can actually darken a bit. When you've got this evening light, um, the skies will actually darken quite a lot going away from the sun. It's not going to do it as much as the photographer is convinced that it is, but it is going to darken. And so you're going to get to do some darker values. And same goes for some clouds that actually have some darker values here. So I actually got a question in the emails this morning from someone who couldn't make it to the live critique and wanted to ask a question of how I choose the colors because they were noticing that the demos, the colors are a bit different than the image and actually seem to look a little bit more like the lighting than the reference itself. And that's kind of what we're really talking about today of um, looking at the reference and deciding what is it that gives that reference the effective lighting that I really like about it. What's happening there that I really like? What's happening there that I want to take and use for my own image? And so deciding that and then choosing to pay attention to that and use that is really really important. So when I'm looking at images, I'm not again looking to copy them directly. I'm really looking to interpret them as best I can. I'm trying to choose colors and values and compositions that effectively portray what I'm seeing, rather than effectively copying what I see. So we're always trying to interpret what we're seeing. So now getting in some of these nice cool colors here. Yeah, I thought some of these shadows here. Another thing, you'll see a lot is they'll push the contrast so much, even in the shadows, to make it seem like it's a really dramatic image, but it tends to fall apart a little bit when you get into actual paintings. Directly copying photographs in paintings rarely works quite as well. I'm not sure why that is, whether we have different expectations of things. Exactly sure what the science behind that is, but we tend to want a little something different out of our images. So we do need to interpret like I'm doing here. Now that we've got this kind of fun stuff, you can actually pop in some of those really bright, fun, awesome lighting on the mountains back here. See, and by doing this, even though the value contrast in that background is going to be pretty subtle, it's going to tie in with what you've started to do here in the foreground. It's going to suddenly tie together the lighting so that it all feels part of one image. Because that's the other thing that'll happen a fair bit is there'll be a disconnect in different areas where the lighting doesn't quite match. I'm not a stickler like some people are with, lighting needs to be 100% scientific accurate to work in a painting. I don't think it actually does. I think you can actually get away with quite a lot in terms of lighting if the lighting seems like it works. If it makes sense on just a quick glance that the lighting is all part of the same world, then you've kind of done enough, and that's as much as you need to do. If it doesn't feel like it's cohesive, if parts of it feel like a different world, like a different painting, then that's when you start to run into trouble and yourself lost. I'd actually also like to fade out some of this. I think I know what you were doing with darkening that to make the foreground pop out, but I actually want to kind of push it back and let some of the darker values in the foreground work to separate these layers. Bring in some more of these nice cool colors here. Yeah, as far as the question goes, it is a tricky image because trying to decide how much to separate out this foreground from the background is tough. There's definitely some distance here, but I don't actually think it's a huge amount of distance. Certainly far away, but I mean, if you look at the trails over here, they're still pretty tiny, so you're getting far away even at that point. So the amount of distance there isn't too much, and I think actually tying them together a bit is okay. You know, even if we're separating layers, it doesn't mean that we need to separate it by a ton. Sometimes even just a subtle amount of separation is enough. Um, and I think I've managed to maintain some of that. All right, so I won't go too much further with that, but I think you get the idea of what I was trying to do there. And now it feels just a bit more cohesive. Feels like one part of one image. Um, uh, yeah, but overall, I think you're doing great. I like what you're doing in interpreting the images rather than directly copying. Just a few thoughts on how to make sure that you're getting the areas that do have a lot of impact in the image and making sure you pay attention to those. Um, all right. All right. These look good. Um, I really like how um, you've analyzed all the colors and lighting here. I think they all do read quite well just right off the bat. Um, just almost in an abstract sense, you get a feel for um, what the time of day is in each of these, and I think that's exactly what you're after. Even though the brushwork doesn't really tell us much about the landscape, the lighting is telling us so much. Um, so I think that works great. Let's see here. I'm not going to have too much to say because I do like what you've done. Um, I really think the only one that could use a bit more love is this third one here. I feel like even though you've kind of sort of captured it, I feel like it seems like a more muted, tentative version of it. Um, excuse me. Um, yeah, yeah. I just feel like it could use just a bit more punch to it. I feel like the reference has quite a lot of impact, and yours is maybe just being a bit too conservative. It could actually be partially. getting some more colors and light into the shadows as well. People always think that light comes from having tons and tons of contrast between the light and the dark, but it's really not. It's really that correct relationship between light and dark. And I also think the sky might be part of the other problem. This is obviously a sky that has been photoshopped all to hell, um, just because photographers are terrible, and will just ruin reference that is otherwise quite good reference. I don't know why they do that, but they love to. So it's obviously made way more warm than it needs to be. So you've obviously corrected a little bit for that. I think you could maybe go a little bit more and then bring in some more bright tones into here. Just a few spots. Obviously, if you want the focal point to be down here, you don't want to go too far overboard, but by having a few spots that up here that are a touch more illuminated, it will actually kind of give context for the ground and help us understand just how bright the light is there. There's maybe a little bit more atmosphere here might be good. You go too far with it, but yeah, because you can see a little bit of it in the reference, but it's kind of been taken out. I think it's missing a bit of that distant horizon. And a few more blues up here. Right. So I just think it has a bit more impact that way and correct some of the annoyances of the reference image of having that too warm sky. Uh, yeah, I think that gets at a better sense of what that lighting setup would actually be like. It still has some of that warmth in there, which I think is kind of an okay stylization, without going so far overboard that it looks like a tinted image. Um, but overall, these are really nice, and really good sense of lighting. So this is the sort of color and lighting stuff that come in handy a lot when we're doing our own images soon. All right, these look good. Let's see here. Um, So there's some little tweaks here that I think make a make a fairly big difference. That I think will help a fair bit. This one, for instance, I think you can do with fading it out a lot more. There's a lot of atmosphere here. You know, you're looking into the light, and you've got a ton of atmosphere over a lake, and so these distant mountains are just really faded out. The value range back there is just incredibly tight, and so getting that is actually quite important for capturing this light. Actually, even a little bit more warmth. We've got quite that much, but a nice warm glow coming off there. Um, I think part of it is almost trying to be a touch too literal with some of your reference images. For instance, this is actually pretty darn spot on, but I feel like you just haven't pushed the colors enough for me to get a real sense of the lighting. I like how faded out it is, and I like how distant it looks. Um, but I feel like some of the blues, for instance, aren't quite blue enough. Some of the greens aren't quite saturated enough, and then the light planes, for instance, on the rocks, aren't quite saturated enough either. Like these areas where the light is hitting are pretty dramatically lit. It doesn't have to be crazy saturated, but in relation to the stuff around it, it just doesn't feel like there's quite enough saturation and kick to it. It feels kind of like a slightly faded out photograph. So even though it's a small thing, but it is important to get that. So maybe just a little bit more saturated here. You've got the range to do it. And it also helps kind of focus it. So, for instance, in the reference, this is far more illuminated and noticeable than it is down here, whereas I'm not getting a real sense of that. It feels like this is almost too contrasty, and this is not illuminated enough. It doesn't take too much. It can even just be a few little areas that get just ever so slightly more contrasty, and suddenly the image feels like it has a fuller value range and a more bright sense of light. This looks pretty good overall. Not too much to say here. I feel like with the foreground, uh, there could be a bit more blues in here. Now they're not too obvious in the reference image. They're there, but partially the values are making it hard to see that they're there, and that's just a problem uh, of of photography in general. The cameras can have a hard time picking up on all the colors in different value ranges. And actually, if you look at this area, for instance, the shadow area, and compare it with yours, you can see that this just has a lot more cool colors in it. And same goes for your foreground areas. That I believe, even though you've got some in there, it would be a fair bit more. And this is one of those times when you kind of go off of the reference image and realize, like, okay, I've got a really bright blue sky, And even though, yeah, I've got all this contrast and stuff, maybe I've got more than enough contrast and can actually do with lightening my shadow areas a bit and bringing in some more of that blue light. Maybe that will actually add more light to my image. And then will also help to push back some of these more distant planes here. And I know all of this stuff seems kind of nitpicky, and it kind of is. Uh, but these little things make a huge difference. If you just have a stronger sense of lighting in your work, you can get away with a whole lot in your paintings. And so these tiny changes to color temperature and lighting and all of that have quite an impact on how your images just have that initial read. Because the first thing people will notice before they really notice what things are is that impact of lighting in a landscape. Even though, like, if I was painting this reference image, yes, I would know this just looks like a dark color, but I know mentally, if I kind of break it down, that uh, okay, yeah, that's pretty far away and very dark. Just because it's so far away, it's probably going to have a bit more blue in it than I think it's going to have. And so I can just mentally accommodate that and assume that it's going to be bluer than I think it is. Um, and then when you get to these shadows in the foreground, realize like, okay, these shadows look really dense, and I'm not getting a lot of form in there, and it just feels like they're so dark that you wouldn't get that on like a bright day like this, even if it is shadowed. So that's when you stylize a bit and bring in some of these nice blue colors. And actually, some of your brights here, I think could actually get toned down a little bit. It's amazing how little contrast you actually need to accomplish a bright spotlight effect. You can really get away with just having a few areas that are actually pretty contrasty in value. You realize how minimal the values can be sometimes to express quite a lot of lighting. And it's just being selective about where they're going and getting that correct value range. And then same goes for these rocks here. You've got kind of what you would normally think is happening in there. That is to say, light and dark. And yeah, they are doing that. But that's one of those times you step back and think, are they actually going to be gray in there? Or is because there's such a blue sky here, maybe they're going to be a little bit bluer than it actually looks. And maybe I need to bring in some more blues, even though I wouldn't necessarily see them right off the bat. In case anyone happens to go plein air painting anytime soon, this is also something you want to keep in mind when you're doing that. That even when you're out there trying to study from life and doing plein air paintings, you're still actually looking to stylize a bit. It's something of a mistake to go out there and actually expect to accurately portray the colors. That is to say, like a camera would. What you're looking to do is interpret the environment. And so by interpreting it, you actually want to enhance and stylize and move and see too many of some colors and not enough of other colors. There is the same interpretive process going on there as in these studies we're doing. I'm also thinking there's going to be some definite bounce light happening in here. Definitely going to be some areas that have a bit more warmth. And so now that I realize there's going to be some warmth in there, And then I just try to look for, okay, where is there probably going to be some warmth? There's going to be warmth in these areas that are catching any of the light bouncing off these lit forms and into the shadows. You're going to start getting it. It's hard to see because you've got all these crazy local colors going on here. You've got so much lichen or moss growing on these that it's obscuring the light um, the light effects that are going on, the color effects that are going on, and making it a lot harder to see those things. This is why sometimes when people do studies to start out with, they'll start out with a plaster cast, which is just pure white. And it makes it super easy to see all of the warms and cools. It makes it incredibly obvious. And you realize that all those exact same things are happening in in a crazy colorful image with lots of different local colors like this. Um, it's a lot harder to see them. So we kind of have to look for them ourselves and or just place them in there where we know they're going to be, even if we can't directly see them. That makes sense. So just a few ideas on how to push these and stylize things a bit. Um, but hopefully that gives you a better idea. But looking good. All right, these look good. Um, nice. Uh, feel like, yeah. Um, again, seeing too many curves here where there's not a lot of curve. Again, super common problem, but it sort of shrinks the mountain by doing that. It makes it smaller than I believe it needs to be and kind of takes away from the epic scale of something like a mountain. And then the other thing is, again, I don't think there's quite enough blue happening in here. So it's not feeling quite far enough away. I'm going to fade some of that out a bit. I'm going to go a bit too far here for a second. If you fade it out a bit, then you get to go in with kind of this darker blue in here and redraw in those nice darks you had in there. Yeah, I just think it needed a little bit more atmosphere there. It's pretty darn far away, and it's got a lot of air you're looking through to get over there. I think this is actually quite successful. Um, yeah, it feels like the lighting that you were looking at, and does a good job of conveying this very strange sort of lighting. It's both kind of cool lighting, but also has some warmth to it. It's very interesting lighting. I like what you've done here with the depth, but you can see that you're not getting quite blue enough here either. Um, you're getting a bit too gray and losing out on things there. The other thing to separate this foreground from the background, I think would actually just require ever so slightly more contrast in a couple areas. A couple areas that are just a little bit darker. Just get these darkest crevices in just a few areas ever so slightly darker in there. At the very bottom in that darkest dark area. And don't go too far overboard with this, otherwise it'll look all disjointed and not make any sense. But just a few spots of that, and then a few spots where I think you get ever so slightly lighter than what you've got. And then I think you're going to successfully separate out your foreground from your background. And don't go overboard with these either, because otherwise it'll look all disjointed and crazy and contrast in the wrong areas. Adding in these areas that are just a little bit lighter, you establish a different value range here where you've got these darks and these lights. And suddenly this feels like a different plane than this background just by doing that. And that's not even without, that's even without fading out this background to a little bit bluer. Yeah. But yeah, it looks good. That's kind of about all I had to say on those. Solid stuff. Right. These look good. I think you could benefit from one thing with a bit more contrast. Again, if we kind of go back to what we think about with the values, do these work as values? And if you kind of pop it over to grayscale and look at the values, and you realize the values are pretty subdued, particularly in the side lit one. I think the backlight actually works fairly well. I think you could benefit from a bit more contrast still. I think you're just a little too tentative with some of your values. And part of that comes actually in the shadows of not being comfortable enough to add in the really dark darks as well as some of the brighter colors. You've got a lot more values here in Photoshop you can play with. And just establishing that value range that yes, it actually does get quite dark in here will help this seem like I think you're trying to get uh, from the reference, where it actually will look almost a little faded out from the light coming from behind. It's going to get just ever so slightly darker in there. Obviously, without seeing the reference, I can't tell you exactly, but I think it's going to push more in that direction and have some more of those darks, even just by adding a couple darks in there that are probably in the wrong place. Uh, it just gets a bit more contrast everywhere in the image, and actually lets you go a little bit lighter in some of the areas, weirdly enough, and still have more contrast. Because now that we've established that there's this, full value range here, it allows us to go a little bit less back here, and still our minds are going to interpret this as the same sort of world. We're going to see some similar forms and interpret that as kind of being the same. You can probably also go a little bit brighter with some of your lights on the ground here. I'm not sure if you need to, but I think if you want it a bit punchier, particularly for something that's backlit, you can go pretty punchy with the light without going too far overboard. And just a few hits of that will allow us to, again, interpret the rest as being that bright. Um, And I think it's kind of similar things with the others that you're not getting quite enough contrast going on. So with this, does it really feel super bright and lit? It doesn't quite get there. It's not quite strong enough. And it just comes down to making sure you've got that full value range. So be sure you check your values all the time and make sure that you've got that. Make sure your darks are getting dark enough and your light's getting light enough. It's very easy to get a little bit off track when you're looking at color. Color is kind of deceptive and encourages us to get so obsessed with color that we forget about values. And I think there's a little bit of that going on in what you got here. So just a little something to keep in mind. But I really like what you're doing with the color. I just think kind of take a step back and think about those values and think about the value range that you can get in there. Even when you're talking about something like the overcast scene, you're still going to get some deeper darks in here than I think you've got. Um, Even just in a few areas, uh, you're going to get some darker values. Even if you want to have lots of nice, bounce light filling this thing in there, in this, darkest corners of this place, it's going to get really dark in there. There's no light getting in there, and it's not that far away. And so you're going to get some darker values in here. And that lets you have this nice diffused, kind of soft values for the rest of the image, um, as long as we establish that there are going to be some darker areas in here. So yeah, just a little bit more thought on some of the values. Right. Um, I think kind of a similar critique here in terms of the values. I think you're going too far overboard. Um, when you, again, you do the grayscale, uh, and you just look at it abstractly, and look at the values. So flip it upside down and just look at the value difference between these two at the bottom. And you notice that this just has tons of contrast, and this is very subtle and then very dark. Uh, but it's a very tight value range that all this stuff happens in, and you tried to see so much of it. Uh, and kind of same goes for most of these, that it just feels like there's a lot of contrast in there happening, when I don't think there actually needs to be that much contrast. It can be a much more subtle interpretation and actually convey a bit more. So, second here. It's obviously the poor man's way of getting out the background, but it does kind of at least illustrate the point. You do want to tend to hand paint this stuff rather than do it this way. At least go over it and repaint it yourself. It'll do some funky things with your colors if you just use light and layers. So I recommend kind of painting over it a bit if you are going to do this. So just by doing that on that one image, it brings the values back in a closer to correct value range. Then when you kind of switch on the values, realize, all right, you've got your foreground here with more contrast and your background here with less contrast. And I think you can do kind of the same thing with some of your lights that I think your lights as well too bright in the background. I think you're trying to see too much contrast back there. And the contrast happens, but it's much tighter value range and much tighter color range than you think it is. It's very subtle. All these things happen in very tight value ranges. And I will often go too contrasty with my backgrounds and make them way over the top. And then I'll zoom out and realize that and have to do this exact thing where I fade things out, where I reduce the contrast of my backgrounds to actually look like the distant areas of the painting and separate them from the foregrounds. So I think that's kind of the big thing that's happening here, is you're seeing just too much. I think this sort of diffuse lighting situation you've got here is the closest to being kind of spot on for what you're looking for. Even that, I think, gets a little too bright in some of the brights. So basically, you're just kind of seeing too much, and you kind of need to rein it in and reduce some of that contrast to bring it into the correct value range, to make it seem a bit more natural. Because by having those correct value ranges, you're going to get the scale and you're going to get the color and the light that we're really talking about here. So it's not that your drawing or your forms are necessarily that far off, nor are your colors wrong. It's kind of a value problem of seeing too much where there's really not that much going on. Um, if that makes sense, but it looks really good. All right, these look great. Yeah, these look These look really good. Um, there's a few spots where you could do with a bit more contrast. Like this one, I think is just almost spot on. I love what you've done with the light here, and I think a few areas actually where it could get ever so slightly darker, um, I think would help the shadow area have as much luminosity as your light area has here. I think there's this last sort of layer of value contrast in those really dark crevices and stuff to make that contrast just a little bit stronger. Well as maybe brighten actually this up a bit right next to the light. One thing you kind of didn't put in there that actually I think is kind of a perfect opportunity to talk about is quite as much bloom as this has. This has quite a lot of this sort of glow to it. And even though, yes, it's something photographers love to play up, it's also something that really happens. And it's kind of part of the reason I want to talk about your backlit scenes the most. I think your top and front lit are spot on. Same goes for your diffuse. And for the most part, aside from maybe a little more contrast in a couple areas, uh, I think are quite good as well. But your backlit don't feel quite as luminous and glowing as I think they could. And part of that is something that happens where light sort of bleeds around edges. If you have something really bright behind something that's really dark, some of the light is going to kind of bleed around that form and glow. And particularly when you're looking into the sun, you're looking through all the atmosphere. And so that atmosphere is going to scatter the light a little bit and encourage that effect of kind of bloom and glow. And I think you're missing out on having some of that because it's really fun stuff to have. And those subtle effects that are, yes, incredibly easy to overdo, add a ton to paintings. Um, there's a reason people like doing backlit scenes, and part of that is getting in this really epic glow. I'm just gonna go in here. I'm gonna way overdo it, sort of intentionally, and I'll rein it back in. Uh, you can see just by adding a little bit of bloom, it's got a little bit more atmosphere to it. Again, probably overdone a smidgen, but it glows a bit more. It's got more of that air to it. Same goes for some of this. I think there could be a bit more of a intensity to what's happening here. Yeah, it definitely can break the silhouettes, and partially you kind of want that. Uh, you want just a little bit, and it can often just happen right on the edge, just right along this edge, basically. Uh, there will just be that much glow. Obviously, not that much glow. It's going to be a little bit more toned down than that, but you can almost see on the reference, even at this low res, there's almost a redness to this edge, and that's because there's that bloom going on even in the camera. And there even seems to be a bit more of that. And it can actually add to something of a softening of the edges where you actually want a softer edge to even something that's a hard form, just because otherwise it can seem really cut out and doesn't feel like part of the same world. So now one of the changes to my working method these days is that one of the last stages of my painting process is actually a really slow, tedious process where to go ahead and add that glow in, I will actually manually zoom in to really close and just finicky just go along every single little edge of my painting and make sure there's enough of that glowing overlap to make sure the edges are just right. Really annoying, and I don't necessarily recommend doing it. It takes forever, but it does add a little bit to the painting. It takes about an hour, and it's really dull, but I do like what it does. Yeah, so it is definitely something of backlit scenes to have clear silhouettes, and they do. My point is not to break up silhouettes. It's again one of those balancing acts of yes, you want very clear silhouettes, but on the flip side, if they're too crisp, they can sometimes just look cut out and not like they're part of this same world. So you can have a clear silhouette while still having bloom. So I haven't really screwed up too much of the clear silhouette there. I think it might maybe could do with a bit more sharpening. Um, you just want a bit of that light bleed around that edge. And it's kind of a tough kind of give and take sort of thing where you can kind of push and pull and figure out how much you want it to have. Maybe you want it to be really strong on one side and really soft on the other. Um, I think it's something that I'd like to see a bit more of for your stuff in particular. That I think the backlit scenes aren't quite feeling as glowing as I think they could. So think about that edge. You can even just add, and this is something that people will do a fair bit, is actually add a fairly crisp brushstroke to the edge that is sort of an in-between color and almost a more saturated color. And that can often give you the glow without messing up your edge too much. So that's another thing to maybe try out. So yeah, overall really nice though. The lighting really reads quite well on these, and I like what you've done. Um, yeah, they work very well. So yeah, looking good. It's looking good. Um, a few things. Um, just on the long study, I actually think there's too much contrast in these background layers. For instance, this up here is way too dark. It's breaking up the sense of distance here. You can realize that probably most of your contrast is going to be here, and I think that's actually fairly well established. And then these layers need to be softened a little bit, and then that needs to be reduced in contrast quite a lot to push it back there. The rest of your values are pretty much on. I like them, but I think pushing those back a little bit more. I actually want to talk more about this one. This is another case of photographer photo that adds way too much contrast in kind of all the wrong areas, but you don't want to entirely lose the good things that are happening there. So I think in yours, there's some places that you could do with a bit more contrast, like the photo, and some other places that you need to almost a little bit less contrast. Dive right in here. One thing is, I think, like the way this is needs to be silhouetted. Part of that, I think, needs to be some more dark values in there. And this is a lot closer than this is. Even ignore the photograph, ignore the values in the photograph for a second, realize that, okay, that's closer than that. So the darks in there are going to get a little bit darker. And actually, that will let you reduce the contrast of these clouds back here and bring them in a bit more correct. Doing that, it lets you save your absolute brightest brights for the light over here, the sun. You want everything else to be toned down if you want that to be able to read correctly. Actually reduce a lot of your contrast of the image so that that does read. There's lots of fun stuff happening over here with these nice warm glows. I'd like to see some more of those brought in here. And then a bit more blues brought into this central rock here. I really like this kind of shadow that's being cast here, and I want to make sure to capture that as best I can. I'm going to make sure I'm paying attention to that edge there. Forms go in there pretty well. To reduce some of the contrast there. Reduce some of the contrast of the local colors here in the foreground. I think they're fairly important to get in there, but I wonder if they're a bit too much and maybe distracting from things. You can definitely have them in there, but you don't want it to seem. The thing with local colors is you don't want to have the local colors detract from the sense of light. You don't want them so contrasty and so obvious that they're destroying your sense of light. Keep in mind that everything behaves within that value range and color range that the light establishes. That's the foremost thing. And then once you've got that, all of those local colors happen. And that's why when you've got the diffuse lighting that is very subtle, you get to really play up those local colors, is because that's the main contrast you're seeing, is everything sort of living in this tight value range. And so we get to focus more on those local colors. If you ever have a scene that it matters a lot, but there are these cool patterns of local colors, that's a time when you might want to use a diffuse or top lit scene. we'll obviously get into once we start making up our own, which is super fun. Always a fun week. And a difficult one. I don't want to go too far with this, but hopefully you're starting to get the idea of what I'm going after here, of balancing out those values to show what's good about this photograph and what's interesting. The nice value relationships, even though the values are dead wrong for what you'd see in real life. You have the sort of the essence of the idea of the values. Even if they're wrong, they do have at least indications that we can use to show off what we really want to show off. Actually, by reducing your contrast in a lot of your image, I've somehow increased the sense of lighting, which is something people always seem to be baffled by. I'll go with that, but hopefully that makes sense. And now I think reads quite a lot better and still doesn't look like the reference, and nor do I want my study to look exactly like my reference here. I think the references values are super wrong, and I do not want to copy those. It gets it a bit closer to the sense of light that I think we want to capture there. Yeah, just thinking about those values and making sure that you're not getting values too contrasty in the wrong areas. Yeah, looking really good. Right. Looking good. Yeah, these look really good. Um, one thing I really like that you've done is you've done the thing we've been talking about of bringing out the light in those dark areas. It would be very easy to just copy this image and have really dense shadows that have no detail to them. So I've liked that you've pushed up the light in those areas to show us more of that. I think that's a really good point. Piece looks good. I think you could go with maybe a bit more bloom here that we talked about. If you look at your reference and you just look at this area, sorry, right here, you can notice that it actually is getting notably lighter. And that is that bloom effect happening, that there's a lot of air in this place here. And so there's a lot of scattering of light where you're looking almost straight into these air molecules. And so they're sort of taking the light and bouncing it into this area. And so you've got a lot of light that's kind of filling in this area. I think a little bit more bloom there would benefit you a bit. Overall, I like it though. Again, I like how you've kind of brought out the shadows a bit more and not made them as dense as the reference. That works fairly well. Side lit looks pretty good. Your water, you're trying to paint water too much, which has gotten you into trouble. Um, you've sort of kind of ignored some of the stuff that's actually happening in the water and focused too much on painting water. Uh, Again, just kind of look at it abstractly, look at it as values and colors, and you realize that you sort of lightened up the image when in fact it's a darker version of the mountain. It's all the values are darker, the shadows are darker, the lights are darker, everything down there is darker than what's above it. Whereas you've kind of gone and added too much blue in there, and there's not going to be quite as much of that happening. This looks good too. Yeah, I mean, overall, really, really good sense of lighting, really good sense of color. This is the exact sort of stuff you want to be doing. Um, yeah, I honestly don't have a lot to say. It's looking really good. It's good. We have another case of seeing too much. Um, Look at the curve here. Look at the curve here. Basically flat. And you've added all these cutting out and indications and all these things. It's really flat. There's very rarely as much going on as people think there is. So watch out for that. Your values, though, are looking pretty nice. Maybe a little more softness overall, which I know is hard to do when you're using chunky brush strokes and stuff, but try to capture a bit more softness. One thing that might help you a bit is your mountain silhouettes are getting off a little bit as you're painting, and so next time you do it, put the mountains on a different layer. Uh, Paint your mountain shapes, get them awesome looking, and lock the transparency down here on those mountains, and that will let you do whatever you want in that layer without messing up the shapes of your mountains, and it lets you be as chunky as possible, um, messing up what you've already done and redrawing things. So that can really help, and it also lets you kind of go back in there and change the mountain shape too. So just a thought technically about that. I think lighting wise, there could be maybe a little bit more lightness in some of the shadow size of this. This is fairly light. Keep in mind that you're still going to get some illumination from the sky, even in a strange sort of lighting like this. You're going to get some illumination of that shadow side. So it might be a dark night sky. When you push up the contrast so much, you're actually going to get um, contrast here on the shadow side and a bit more light filling in these shadows. You can see in there in the reference to reduce the contrast a bit, and I think a little bit more light in there. Still looking good. Again, I think it's seeing too much as far as values go. If you started to look at this in terms of values, I think there's just too much contrast back here, because this is going to be quite faded out. On a scene like this, the values are incredibly tight back there because there's just a ridiculous amount of atmosphere going on. And up here in the foreground, I like what you've done with the colors. Actually, all these nice little warms and greens and all that stuff happening there. I think that works really well. So I think the value range in the foreground is about right. I just want to see more faded out background here to make this whole image make more sense. Looks good. I like what you've done there. You've done a good job of getting all the colors and stuff in there. And a good you can always go more overboard with that, but you want to be careful with that. This is a case where you might be tempted to divert from the reference image a little and add ever so slightly more detail into some of the shadows to make it a more interesting painting. So you could actually do with having a little bit more cool light in here in some of the shadow areas without completely destroying your silhouettes. You don't want to go overboard because again, that's going to kill the sense of backlit here, but you do have to remember that photography is not going to see as much detail in these shadows as you would see if you were standing right there. you'd see a little bit there. So it's at least something to think about and consider adding, at least in a very tight value range. Really like what you've got here, though. I think this works very well. Yeah, I think value and color-wise and lighting-wise, I think that works fairly well. I actually think you could go a little bit more contrasty with the spot of light. I think there's just ever so slightly a little more contrast there. That's all. Not even more than that. There's a little more there. I would just say, in general, just as a general critique, be a little bit more careful with your edges. You're sort of in an awkward point of your edges of not being so loose with them that it's clear you're not trying to observe the edges, but also not quite tight enough in areas where it just kind of feels like soft, mushy edges, um, where you've got hard and soft edges right next to each other, where you should generally just have, hard edges for the outside of this. Just a general critique, not really too much to do with the lighting. Um, just uh, just something to be aware of as we're moving forward. Pay a little extra attention with those edges. And if you want, do this technique of putting it on a different layer and locking the transparency. I think that can help a whole lot. I personally struggle a ton with getting my edges right and always messing them up and having to repaint them and all that. So you might find it helpful as well. All right. Good. Um, I think just kind of more more of everything. I think you're doing all the right stuff and you're painting it quite well. And I really like some of the drawing you're doing here. I actually love the drawing you've got. You've got a good sense of the form, and they're actually really nicely stylized. Uh, and I really like the way the line work is almost implemented in it. I just think now, looking at it, they don't have enough impact. I think the values are a slight bit too weak and need a little more contrast in a few places. Whether that's color contrast or value contrast, it depends. A little bit more punch, more saturation in places, a little more value contrast in other places. Same goes for actually this middle image that it's pretty much spot on, but doesn't have quite the same punch and could go with more contrast in areas. Um, Very close. I love what you've done with these blues and greens up here. I think that's working great. I wonder if maybe a little bit darker in a couple places. I want them to kind of stay overall as light as you've got them, but I wonder if in perhaps maybe the darker areas you have a chance to go a little darker, fill out that value range a little bit more. Even if you mostly keep them this really light faded blue, which I think works great, maybe bringing in a touch more contrast there. Same goes for this shadow area. Um, even though, yes, it's far away, it's sort of contrast is keyed such that you don't have much of a foreground. So you've got the chance to do that and put in some darker darks over there. Be also darkening up the reflection, as reflections do, of course, tend to be darker whenever they're reflecting. So not too much I do have to say about these. Again, I think a little bit darker in places, a little bit bluer, a little bit more saturation, but these are really tiny tweaks. They're not major things that I think you need to change, because I think for the most part you are getting the right sense of color and the right sense of lighting. Also, just on a style note, I do love how you're starting with this line stuff, and if that's something you enjoy doing and want to keep doing, I'd encourage you, because I think it's giving you some nice structure to your paintings. But yeah, looking really good. It's really, really solid stuff. I like it. Okay, these look really good. Um, yeah, these are looking great. These are much better edge work than you have turned in before, so that's really good to see. Much stronger sense of form and clarity of the shapes, which is great to see. Yeah, this is a good direction for you in general, and specifically as it relates to lighting. I think you're doing a good job of things. Um, as with a lot of people, I think you're missing out on that last bit of sort of ignoring the reference and bringing in some more of the blues. So if you look into these shadows, they do have a fair bit of illumination here. Like, yes, it's far away. It's kind of almost backlit, I suppose. It's kind of borderline between top lit and backlit, but regardless, it's got a lot of shadow areas, but also a lot of blue sky. And so I think bringing in some more of that blue sky is kind of what I'd like to see from you. Is do another pass where you think about that blue sky. I know some artists will actually paint a kind of an ambient light layer where they just paint the ambient light on things, and they'll actually do it in separate passes where using some layered tricks, they'll have a different pass for like the main light, and they'll have a pass for the diffuse overhead light, and they'll do like an ambient occlusion light and do all these different like light passes like you would with a 3D renderer. And even though it's way too technical for me that I would never actually want to do that, because it sounds like a nightmare. Um, the thought process I think is pretty valuable. Um, this is a case where I think these are pretty gray colors, probably in the reference, but I would like to see a little bit more blue in them, just so that it keeps tying in with the sky color here. When you've got a sky that is this blue, it's going to tend to fill it in with some pretty blue colors in there. I think a similar thing happens here, where yes, you're seeing it, but I think a step further than you've got it to actually reduce some of the contrast and bring in uh, that diffuse blue lighting in the shadows. Not too much to say though. Again, I think this is a good direction for you, and I like what I'm seeing here. So yeah, looking good. Right. Really like this top one. I noticed it right off the bat when I looked at all the homework this morning. This is a great example of a foreground that is better than the reference. The reference directly copied would look like garbage because there's no organization here. And so it's just this mess of colors and values and no idea what's going on. But you've broken it down nicely here and simplified it, and I think it works fantastic. So I love what you've got here. With the background rocks, I'd like to see the shadows worked on a bit more. Um, with the shadows, again, it's something that's hard to pick up in the photography, but if you go to some desertous areas, if you happen to get lucky, and see these red rocks in this direct lighting, you're going to notice that there's both a ton of bounce light and a ton of blue light filling in these shadows. So if you look at Western painters, you'll tend to see them playing that up a lot. So rather than going kind of brown in these shadows, like it would most of the time, um, try to play up the fact that there is warm bounce light and cool skylight in there, even more than you might necessarily be seeing in the reference. Bring in those nice cool colors on the top, the shadows, and then also just bring in those really nice warm saturated bounce light colors. It's a case where you can absolutely exaggerate things. It's going to get a stronger sense of lighting. I don't want to go too far overboard with any of these things, but just want to kind of show you, yeah, you can actually reduce some of the contrast that you've got in here, and shadows will still read as shadows. I actually think they could be, the light areas could be lightened up a bit, or maybe got darkened down a little too much. This is also another time when you've got almost times where it seems like the lights of these rocks are going to get darker, or sorry, get lighter than the sky above them. They're still not. You still got a bit more room there to play with than it seems. So you can actually lighten these up a little bit, and that will give you a little bit more contrast in your shadows, which will let you bring in some brighter, more saturated colors to show some of the bounce light and some of the blue light. So it's that balancing act that we talked about. But really nice overall. I love the foreground again. Not much of anything to say about that. You could maybe make some of your shadows a little bit bluer and some of them a little bit oranger, but that's getting a little nitpicky. I think this one could use a little bit more stylization to read correctly. I feel like the shadow area here is getting just a touch too dark. I actually want to see you bring in a little bit more light into these foreground leaves, just to kind of make it a little bit more sense. When you're taking a photograph of something like this, you've got to expose it really dark because this is actually surprisingly bright and super annoying to photograph. Because otherwise, this turns solid white, and then this is just solid black, basically. It's really annoying. And so I think for the sake of compensating for the photograph, maybe a little bit more contrast and light in the dark areas there. Um, this I think is pretty good. There's some areas that I think you got too contrasty, and you could go with doing a bit bluer here in the background. Fade those back a little more, which lets you play up the contrast with the foreground. I'd like to see a little stronger sense of lighting here in the foreground, both from some darker darks to few spots of darker darks, lots of brighter values. Um, you've you've got the range here that it won't throw off the image to have brighter colors here in the foreground. And by sort of establishing the value range here, it allows you to be subtle back here with the value range because we're going to tie together that same lighting scheme. So we're going to assume the lighting is the same. So we can go more contrasty here and people will just kind of read in their minds that it's the same sort of level of contrast back here. Another thing with painting snow is don't be afraid to get too bright with it. You actually can go really bright. Snow is one of those stupid things that breaks all of the rules, and you can actually go basically just pure white with a lot of it, or very close to pure white, especially when it's illuminated. It is at least as bright as your clouds are probably going to be. They're obnoxiously bright, so it's another thing that'll help to establish those value ranges that will allow you to be subtle and contrasty in other areas. And by doing that, getting the right sense of lighting in the whole scene. But looking really good. Um, yeah, I like what you're doing. Doing great. All right. Let's see what we got here. These are looking good. Really like what you've got here. This looks really good. Yeah, very, very strong. Um, I, maybe it's mislabeled, but I don't consider it diffuse lighting. I consider that more backlighting or top lighting. Labeled wrong, but I really like it. It's exactly what you want to do. It's got that nice layering effect, so that you're differentiating the layers going back here, and you've got this tight value range that explains plenty about what's happening with the lighting. I think this spot here could actually do with a bit more color slash contrast. Um, I think you could do with a little bit more there. I like the subtlety in general, but usually when you've got a scene that's that subtle, it gives you a chance to have one or two times when you sort of break that subtlety and go a bit more intense with your colors or your contrast. Same goes for that snow back there, that I think you could play that up and make it seem way more intense. Um, Overall, though, looking really nice. Like the master studies. Um, this looks really good. There's a little bit of oddness here that I think you could actually go a bit bluer and more subtle with some of these background shadows. So reduce the value contrast and let that be a nice color contrast. There's tons of distance. They're way far back there. And so I'd actually reduce some of the value contrast there. There's such a separation of these layers. And then in this foreground area, it's feeling just, my general impression is, oh, that looks a little too brown. And there's a couple things here. For one thing, I think your bounce light can get a bit more saturated, and you can bring in some more saturated colors, and that'll get it away from that sort of brownish look that rocks like this can have, where they just feel a little too dull in color. You're seeing the right bounce light and stuff. I think you can get a bit more saturated in there. Also, I don't think that you've got as many of the cooler colors in there to play off. Those cool colors can often just be grayish colors, and you got some of that going on in there, but I want to see a bit more of it. I think the shadows are, in general, a little bit grayer and less brown than you've got them. It's a subtle balancing act of making sure, but when my initial impression is, oh, that's brown, that's not what you want out of a nice luminous rock study like this is. Adding that much more grays and blues and oranges in there is enough to make it pop. It's kind of like the stuff that you're studying here in these shadows, with a few brushstrokes of nice grays it's transformed the shadows from being what could be kind of brownish shadows into nice luminous ones. Because if you actually take those out and turn it into this orange, red, brown color, you can see how much of the light just gets taken out. A lot flatter and less kind of cohesive with the whole scene. Got some of the lighting, but looking really good. Really good studies. All right, these look really good. Um, yeah, really strong stuff. All right, I want to talk about a couple things here. Uh, yeah, you're missing out on a bit of a chance to use more atmospheric perspective here to show the nice color in this landscape and the nice lighting that's happening. Because my initial impression of this is that I like it. It's doing a lot of good things, but it doesn't quite feel like there's enough depth going on in here. It feels a little too flattened out. And so start to diagnose like, okay, so why is that? Why is this feeling a little too flat? And I start to look at it and I realize that this area here is way, way, way more faded out than you've got it. It's got really, really faded out blues, really faded out contrast here. So you're missing that sense of blue that's going to give it that depth. It's shocking how low contrast backgrounds can get and just how blue some of those mountains can get, especially when you're dealing with massive landscapes like this that just stretch on and on and on and on and on. We're not used to seeing, anybody who lives in a city for sure is never used to seeing mountains that go this far away. They're, ridiculously distant. And so we're not used to dealing with this much atmosphere in our day-to-day lives, except for the really lucky people. By fading some of that back, that lets us separate that layer into a different sort of world. That lets us pop out this layer a little bit more. I think that kind of definitely gets it a lot closer. I'm seeing here. Don't forget the atmospheric perspective as you're doing these color and light studies, because even just that little change there is enough to add depth to this and allow us to make sense of it and add some more color and light to our world. Atmosphere is really, really, really important and adds a lot to our value ranges that we're dealing with. I like what you're doing here. I think this is working great. I actually think you can reduce some of your value range there. In your lights, I believe they could do with actually being a little less contrasty. A little bit bluer. Nobody goes blue enough. That's apparently my critique for today, is everyone needs to add more blue. But yeah, actually reducing some of the contrast, bringing it back into these kind of midtones. That's the other thing that'll happen with atmospheric perspective is it does tend to bring your lights a little bit darker. Even if you were standing right next to it, it would be quite a bright color. When you're doing it this far away, it's going to actually darken down a little bit. And so I actually think you'll get a better sense of light if you reduce some of the contrast there. Yeah, just a little thought there. So just some little tweaks with some of your values and some of your atmosphere, but overall really, really nice. Getting a pretty strong sense of lighting on all these, and it's pretty good to see. Um, your diffuse one, I think you do with a little bit more softness. When I look at it, I don't really get a sense of softness, whereas when I look at the reference, I'm like, oh yeah, it's just gradual gradients and stuff. It's hard to do with hard brushes. And it is a case where you can actually work in a bit with a soft brush. Don't be too afraid of using a soft brush from time to time. I know I often tell people not to because they can get themselves into trouble. But there are times when you really want to fade things out and you want to have some smooth gradients. And it's really hard to do without a soft brush. Sometimes I don't know used why pros always tell people not to use soft brushes. I get it because they get themselves into trouble by using soft brushes too much, but it's also unrealistic to expect people to be able to do perfect gradients and these nice smooth forms and stuff without actually using a soft brush from time to time. By softening a little there, reducing some of your contrast in places and smoothing out some of your gradients, it starts to feel a little bit more diffuse and less like it's a directly lit scene. So yeah, looking really good. All right, is it good? We have a question. I was wondering what your solution for expressing that the plane that the bounce light is on is one rounded plane instead of two. Um, in general, um, oh, I assume based on this, the fact that there's this strip of light, that's just a case where it's going to look like that. Typically, when you're trying to express a rounded plane, it can actually help to express it as two separate planes. You almost want to play up the fact that there's a plane change anytime you can, because it will actually strengthen and solidify the sense of form that you're getting. You almost want to add more straight lines. If you think about doing figure drawings and stuff, you want to accentuate the angularity of things and bring in more straight lines and solid stuff happening. Um, I really like what you've got going on with the side lit one here. I think that works great. I think that's very successful. Very strong sense of color and lighting and values. I think that's great. For this one here, I'd sort of break from the reference a little bit and bring in a little more uh, detail and contrast into the shadow here. And see into it just a little more than you've got. And a little bit more of that going on in there. Case of what I would see there if I was standing there more than what I'm getting from the reference photo. I want to bring in a little bit more of those blues in there, those nice cool colors that are illuminating this from the sky. It's going to be nothing compared to your main light source, but it is going to be a little bit there. Also, just like one quick pass with just a touch of bloom, and that's going to feel a lot brighter. So it's not something you want to overdo. It's something easy to overdo, but make sure you kind of get it in there. Same goes for, I think you could use a little bit more atmospheric perspective here. It's pretty tight scene as far as some of the other stuff we looked at today, as far as distance goes, but there's still a lot of atmosphere there, even though it's not as far as some of the other stuff. The fact that we're looking into the light source plays up the atmospheric perspective. Gives us a more, I guess, acute angle. I think that would be the word, to the light source. And it makes it a lot more notable that you're having this intense atmosphere going on. But overall, looking good. And that looks like it. Oh, wow. Um, so yeah, really, really good work overall. You guys did some fantastic studies. Um, Extremely proud of all of these. I think they're working great, and yeah, this is going to come in a lot of handy as we move into doing our own imaginative scenes. Um, Stuff is incredibly important because as you come up with your own scenes, you'll have sort of this toolkit of color palettes and lighting setups that can best show off what you're looking to show in your landscapes. So really, really good work. You guys really seem to lock on to what this lesson was all about, and yeah, I really like what I've seen. So looking great, and yeah. So good luck in this coming week, and we will have another critique the same time next week, and can't wait to see what you come up with. So good luck, and I will see you next week.